Hello and welcome to Nectar Podcast, brought to you by Digital Beehive. I'm your host Lauren Flatt, and this is the series where we take real-world NEC experience, challenges, and make sense of them. Without the jargon, without the waffle, and with a healthy dose of honesty. We keep things simple here. Real stories, real lessons, and the occasional moment where we all stop and ask, who on earth thought this contract option was a good idea? Our job is to take what can be a painfully complicated process and turn it into something practical, clear, and dare I say, actually useful. Today is episode 1, and we're starting with a contract that underpins a huge chunk of the construction delivery across the UK and beyond. NEC4 Option A. And I'm joined by two people who have seen every flavour of Option A out in the wild. The good, the bad, and the truly catastrophic. Neil Earnshaw and Glenn Hyde are with me, and together we're breaking down what Option A really is, when is it used, and the mistakes that trip up project teams time and time again. So let's get into it. To kick us off, can you explain whether all NEC contracts come with main option choices?
Good question. Most of them do. So, for example, the engineering construction contract, term service contract, the engineering construction subcontract, and the professional service contract all have main options, but some of the other forms don't have main options. So, for example, the supplier contract, the design, build, operate contract, the alliancing contract, and none of the short contracts have main options.
And for our listeners who are new to NEC, what's the logic behind why we have some options on some contracts and on other contracts we don't have the options?
Certainly, I guess it depends on the client's choice of procurement route. And certainly with the short contracts, they're designed for simple, less complex work where you don't need, for example, cost reimbursable options in them.
Let's talk about Option A specifically. In your views, when is Option A the right choice?
Option A, it's commonly well known as a lump sum fixed price type of contract. So Option A, when it's a well-defined scheme, generally is when it's going to be most applicable, because some of the other options we'll discuss at other points, if they're less well developed, there's a lot more risk involved. So contractors going to price risk and the tender price will go up. And depending on how well defined or undefined it is, the project might become unviable, where the contractor is trying to price too much risk in some of these other options. So the general view with Option A is that it's a relatively well-defined scheme, so that the contractor could put sensible risk allocation to it. It gives this balance of less value for the client and cost certainty, but also it is this trade-off where clients want the cheapest price, but they also want cost certainty with it, and you can't really sort of have the two together. So Option A, relatively well-defined scheme, and also it's simpler administration. So less administration in the sense of there's no checking of the actual cost incurred by the client. It's all based on this activity schedule that the contractor is going to produce.
You use the term well-defined quite a lot. What does a well-defined scope look like in practice?
So I'm thinking that it doesn't matter whether it's traditional or design and build. The client needs to have defined what the requirements are well. So it doesn't matter where they're at in the evolution of the design. It might be just an output spec, but if it has to be well thought out and well developed, otherwise you will get more compensation events afterwards.
Yeah, and it's that administration. So compensation events in themselves have a big level of administration, and we're trying to Option A, less administration for both parties in terms of administering it. I mean, that shouldn't be the main focus. You don't want to choose Option A because you want less administration, but where it gives the opportunity for that, then obviously it's a good fit.
And just generally speaking, Option A, more straightforward than other options, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, let's strip Option A back to its raw basics. So Option A, the contractor is going to take the tender, the documents, and they're going to produce fundamentally this thing called an activity schedule. I guess we should start with that. So an activity schedule is breaking the project down into a number of items, and they're then going to put an element of cost against each of those items, and the sum of all of those items then add up to the tender price that has been submitted. So that then forms the activity schedule, and they're submitting this at tender stage. So this is part of the tender return, and it will be, part of the evaluation process. And the most important thing then is the contractor is then going to be paid in accordance with this activity schedule. So for option A, it exists at tender stage, the activity schedule. It reflects the total of the prices, and then is the payment mechanism along the way during the life of the project. Because each period, the contractor is going to be putting forward their application for payment, and they only get paid upon completed items on the activity schedule. So one of the fundamental things that people miss out on sometimes is not breaking that activity schedule down into sufficient detail, because literally it is paid when it's complete.
So, for anyone who hasn't delivered an option A before, what are the headline characteristics of an option A?
I think that's the biggest one, that we've just said, that it has to be broken down into sufficient detail, because it's meant to be an easy, quick payment mechanism. If you bid a job at £4 million under option A, the contractor is going to be paid £4 million. And then this application and the assessment of the evaluation during the life of the project is simply just, okay, how much you're going to be paid along the way. And at the end of the day, you will get paid that £4 million at the end of the project. We'll obviously talk about compensation events shortly, but as compensation events aside, the contractor will be paid £4 million to the penny if there's no other changes. So breaking that activity schedule down into sufficient size value that allows the contractor sensible cash flow, because obviously cash is king, right? And they want money coming in the door to be able to buy materials, manage their resources and such like. So it's vitally important that a contractor obviously has a sensible, good cash flow.
So, you've talked there about what an activity schedule is. More importantly, what isn't it?
So the activity schedule, the common misconception is that it tells the contractor what to do in terms of it has some kind of specifying or describing function to describe the works. Whereas it's not that at all. Its function in option A is purely commercial. And I think another thing, just because we may be broadcasting internationally here, is to clarify that when we say schedule in this context, we mean money, not time. Okay?
Yeah.
So the activity schedule is just a list of lump sum activities, and as a general rule of thumb, a contractor would want to make sure that the activity schedule is broken down into pieces of work that are generally, as a rule of thumb, no longer than for a month's worth of work. So that every month as work is progressing, there'll always be something complete for payment.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the other things about the activity schedule is that the risk of omissions or errors in it sits with the contractor. So again, I think for me, what good practice is at tender stage is that the client often needs to evaluate multiple tenders, so they need some consistency across the bidders. So they should describe the sort of key elements of the work, the pricing, but they should allow the contractor to break the activity schedule down into as much detail as they want or need, because they understand in more detail their program, and therefore there's a direct link in this contract, in option A, between the program and the activity schedule. Okay, so as some of the key things, another misconception sometimes is that you could be paid for a percentage complete. Do you see that, Glenn?
Yeah, I see that a lot, where contractors assume, like on most projects, if we've done 50%, then we'll be paid 50%. But the clause is very clear. Contractors paid for completed items on the activity schedule. So yeah, that's again why they need to break it down into sufficient detail. Some of the other common issues that people have is, as Neil's pointed out, errors in the activity schedule remain with the contractor. So one of the clauses, 20.1, says the contractor provides the works in accordance with the scope.
Yeah.
Activity schedule is not scope. That's maybe one of the biggest common misconceptions, that if a contractor's put on there, install 20 manholes, the value or the quantity isn't really relevant, because the scope says on the drawings show what they need to do. And if they've miscalculated and we need 24 manholes, but there's no change to the scope, then the fact that they've said 20 in the activity schedule doesn't mean that they're entitled to something different. And if they've missed something off the activity schedule, and even though the project manager will have accepted the activity schedule, potentially, it doesn't mean that the contractor's now off the hook with that.
Yeah.
So they need to ensure always that the activity schedule does reflect the scope And anything they've missed is the contractor's risk. The flip side of that, of course, is that anything they valued that they can do cheaper, then that's obviously their benefit.
Yeah.
So with option A, risk and reward is the greatest with option A, and unfortunately, you don't get one without the other. If you're investing money, if you want to make money, then you have to put it in a high interest, and yes, you've got a chance of making money. You've also got a chance of losing money.
Yeah.
So there is a balance, a trade-off there between the two.
So we live in a fast-paced world and things are always changing. One of the questions that I hear all the time is whether the contractor can or should revise an activity schedule after the contract has been awarded. What's the correct position on that?
Yeah, well, the contract does allow provisions for revising the activity schedule. It talks about whether the activity schedule no longer reflects how the contractor plans to do their work. They might have an item that they were originally going to do in one go, but now they're going to split it, and that might be at two completely different places in the program. So there might be now a big gap between the two, and if they didn't split that out, then they wouldn't get paid until it's completed, which might be several months down the road. So the contractor at that point can propose a revision of the activity schedule. But this is one of the things that the project manager has then got to accept. So until it's issued and accepted, the old one still stands. And in the contract, there's 3 reasons why the project manager can reject revised activity schedule. One is it no longer reflects the items on the accepted program. 2 is it's not reasonably distributed. There's an element of subjectivity there, but excessive front loading. It just needs to be sensible. And I think that's a fairly sensible judgment that can be made. It's unlikely to be an issue. And the other simple one is it needs to add up to the total of the prices. So a contractor can't redistribute things and add values, and all of a sudden it adds up to £500,000 more. Interestingly, even if the project manager accepted that revised activity schedule and it was wrong, that doesn't mean the contractor's off the hook, because the only way to change the total prices, in simple terms, is through implemented compensation events. So an accepted activity schedule that's plain wrong, the project manager would just ask them to correct that. So it is important that the contractor understands that and only revises the activity schedule when absolutely necessary. I don't know if you see it, Neil, where contractors sometimes feel a bit like the program. They almost every month want to revise their activity schedule just to try and improve the cash flow.
Yeah. I've seen that in the past. Yeah, the reasons for revising the activity schedule should be pretty rare in my experience. There shouldn't be much cause. I think one of the big issues I've seen is where contractors haven't realised that they're only paid when an activity is complete. Then, if the project manager strictly enforces the contract, then it would cause harm to cash flow.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, that isn't a reason for changing the activity schedule. But in those circumstances, I usually advise people that it would be sensible to agree to do so. So if you get the contractor and the client to agree to revise it in those circumstances, then that's absolutely fine. But the project manager doesn't have the power to deal with that himself. It needs the consent of both parties.
Yeah.
It's true. I've often wondered that I think at the end of the day, the contractor can come up with a reason why it doesn't reflect their works. It could be fairly small, obscure item that truly doesn't reflect. So which does allow them to revise the activity schedule and why they're there. If they then want to split items out, is there any that stops them doing that? Because the contract's not specific enough. So I think practically speaking, you can always find a reason why it doesn't quite reflect. And then is there anything to stop the contractor just breaking something down? So if there's an area here that does need adjusting, what stops the contractor adjusting other parts while they're in there? I don't think it does.
Yeah. No, great point. Yeah, you could probably find that reason, couldn't you?
I think so.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, the project manager should be wanting the contractor to deliver. The client wants the contractor to deliver. So if a slightly improved cash flow is going to help the contractor deliver, then why wouldn't the project manager want, and the client, why wouldn't they want to accept the revised activity schedule in that basis?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So as long as it's not gamesmanship, as long as they're not trying to do something that clearly isn't really for the benefit of the client, like excessive front loading, things like that, then I don't think there's generally, as long as it's sensible, they should get that accepted. Another important one, when I've done that myself as a contractor, I've always explained, when I've revised the activity schedule, I've literally given a list of what I've changed and why I've changed it.
Yeah.
And when I've done that, I can't recall ever the client ever having a problem with it. If you don't do that, they might be a bit suspicious of, hang on, what are they up to? Are they trying
Yeah.
to manipulate things? So again, just explain. I think that works a lot with NEC. When you're submitting things, explain what you've done and why you've done it, and it should pave the way for
Yeah.
what you want, which is an acceptance.
Yeah, that it works in many of the clauses in the same way. That if you're transparent about what you're doing and why you're doing it, it will help the project manager to get to acceptance.
Yeah.
When people are worried about what's actually going on because you've not given enough detail, you're not giving enough explanation, there's more of a tendency to not accept the submission.
Yeah. And I think it
That's
goes
a good
back to
point.
10.2,
Mm,
mutual trust and cooperation.
Mm.
So yeah, definitely.
mm.
Glenn, you mentioned earlier compensation events. Now, under Option A, always a big talking point. How should they be assessed under an Option A?
That's one of the big misconceptions, that activity schedule rates will be used to assess compensation events. Well, they can be, but really importantly, only by agreement.
Okay.
And I think sometimes we have to explain by agreement is both parties agreeing, not the client saying this is how I want it because I'm the client. So we, by agreement, yes. And it makes it easier if we've got a rate, I don't know, if we go back to a manhole again, install manhole, £5,000, the client's instructed another one, it's about right. So let's both agree that we just use that, because as we talk about on other podcasts, compensation events are difficult to get agreed. They
Yeah.
are problematic. They take time. You don't know neither party knows the liability. So this is one quick way we can come to a resolution. And yeah, certainly small value ones, they're easier to agree anyway.
Yeah.
So by agreement, we can use the activity schedule rates. But if one party doesn't agree, and it could be the client doesn't agree because they think actually it's less than £5,000, or the contractors maybe lost money on that first one and they want to assess it, the contract then refers to defined cost,
Yeah.
which is then building it up in accordance with the schedule of cost components. Or for Option A, it will be the short schedule of cost components here. So generally speaking, it will be built up from first principles, and then we're going to follow that compensation process.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think an important build on that is that you're not constrained to using any rates and prices in the activity schedule instead of defined costs. You can actually use any rates and prices. It might just be from your own market knowledge that you might think, well, it's about £1,000, and the project manager might go, yeah, I think it's about £1,000 as well. So to me, the rates and prices could come from literally anywhere.
Yeah.
Could come from pricing books, previous contracts you've worked on. It's not constrained to anything within the activity schedule. But remember, we're only doing that. It's intended to be a shortcut for kind of low value compensation events. But I suppose you could do it with high value ones. It's just in the way the contractor priced the whole job as a lump sum in the first place.
Yeah.
You could, I guess, do an estimate with quantities, rates, and prices as a replacement. But I think that's probably rarer where that happens. Usually, when it is a large value, people prefer the openness and the transparency of defined cost.
Yeah.
I think one of the caveats we'll have to make throughout these podcasts is subject to Z clauses. So
Yes.
we can't allow in all these podcasts the myriad of Z clauses people might have, but sometimes there are rates agreed in the contract, in frameworks. So with all of this, assessing compensation events, there may be bespoke rules that you would follow, but obviously, as the standard contract, it would be the schedule of cost components.
Yeah. So just a big frustration for contractors is doing CE work but not having no way of being paid until the CE is implemented. Can you talk about the practical challenges of that?
Yeah, that's a big problem. As an example, I worked on a contract a couple of years ago where the compensation events were about 10% of the total prices, which ended up being about £7 million worth of compensation events. And at a point in time, most of them were unimplemented. So if the project manager had strictly enforced the contract would be best part of £7 million in a hole, in terms of I've spent the money dealing with the issues, I've done the additional work, but I can't get paid for it. So in those circumstances, the client and the contractor agreed. Again, you had the consensus there, where they agreed to pay on account, where the project manager was confident that it was a CE to start with, and that we were just sorting out the value. Because what you have to remember is with compensation events, the compensation event process from notification through to implementation could take between 3 and 6 months.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the contractor has done the work or is doing the work. So they're spending money without receiving any income for it. And that can, I mean, that was, I think my example was quite an extreme example
Yeah.
because, on reflection, because there were over 500 compensation events at the end of this Option A contract, you reflected on whether actually they should have chosen a different main option,
Yeah.
because there shouldn't be that high volume of compensation events. But unfortunately, if you ask around industry, they will always say there's a high volume of compensation events, and it's not a flaw of the contract, because the contract really thought there would be few compensation events to deal with when it was designed. The high volume issue is because, going back to what we said earlier about having a well-defined scope,
Yes.
high volumes of compensation events show that the scope wasn't well defined.
Yeah, just to add to that, so just to reiterate that when we said a contractor's paid in accordance with completed items on the activity schedule, with compensation events, they only make the activity schedule once they're implemented.
Mm.
Yeah.
So that's this gap that we've got in the meantime, where if the contractors partway through or even have completed the works, if they're not agreed, then there's no way of actually being paid. But I see that a lot, that the Nielsen, where the client is agreeing it's a compensation event, they've agreed 70% of the cost so far, and they're still having those discussions about the final 30%, and they're clearly not thinking it will be the 30%, but it might be some of it. So they might pay the 60, 70% on account. But that's not a contractual obligation, but that's just a solution, but especially when the project manager's aware that they have been party to slowing the process down potentially. So in those areas, it's quite nice when they will actually honour that on agreement. But obviously, the cleanest way is for both parties to get through that CE process and get to that resolution. And if need be, project managers make their own assessment. So
Yeah.
don't just, if you think it's 70% of the contractor's quote, then assess it and it's implemented.
Yeah.
Mm.
Well, just going back to yours, Neil, on the 500 compensation events.
Mm.
Hopefully, they were using a digital system.
They were using a digital system,
Yeah.
for sure, yeah, and that certainly helped.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, probably the subject of a different podcast in detail, but you know, they help with the management of the process. They do help to speed it up, give you transparency of where everything's at in that process, and
Yeah.
hopefully then teams can use that intelligence to identify where people are getting stuck,
Yeah.
and then divert resources into getting things freed up and moving through the process to implementation.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So next I'm going to touch on the biggest recurring issues that we're seeing with Option A. So across all of the Option A contracts that you've supported, were there any repeat issues that never seemed to go away, that just kept coming back and back again? Is there anything from your experiences that you can share with us?
The main problem I see is just the level of unagreed compensation events is the biggest recurring thing. As Neil said, in theory they shouldn't happen, but once you've got the option, you've got to work with that option through to a conclusion. So yeah, just the level of change and the potential for not being paid for that level of change, which then puts pressure on the contractor in so many ways.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're contributing to those delays of the agreement, and other times they're not, and they're really sort of hands are tied, so to speak. So that's probably the biggest one I see with Option
Yeah.
A.
Yeah, and I'd agree. I mean, I think we've covered some of the big problems that we see as we've gone through today. You know, the problems with misunderstanding what the function of the activity schedule is, thinking that it specifies and describes the works when it doesn't, not breaking it down into enough detail. They're big ones, and the compensation issue is, yeah, it's absolutely fundamental.
So you'd say insufficient details on the activity schedule is quite a big trap.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. People make this assumption that you will be paid on account and you'll apply for 60%, and the project manager might go, no, I don't think it's 60, I think it's 50%. You know, whereas it's actually, if you look at option B does allow, which is the bill of quantities option, that does allow the payment of proportions of lump sum items.
Yeah.
But you can do percentage complete if you like in option B, but option A does not have those words.
Mm. I've seen some contractors just not including an activity schedule at tender stage, which then means you're starting the job without an agreed mechanism of being paid. I'm always, I was going to say always mystified. Nothing surprises us anymore.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
you kind of
true.
spoon fed with Option A. you're filling in contract data part 2. There's a space for our activity schedule is in, and then there's a space. And the idea is you tell them where within your tender submission it is. So that's sometimes a missing. Something else actually I've just thought of that is a recurring problem is clients giving an activity schedule for the contractor to price at tender stage. And it's not really an activity schedule. They call it an activity schedule. It's a tender comparison document. And traditionally, it's fairly high level. I totally understand why the client does it, and that's fine, but call it what it is, a tender comparison document.
Yeah.
Because some contractors then feel that they're stuck with the client's activity schedule. And it's normally fairly high level, and they're putting values in, and then they're submitting that to be a compliant bid.
Yeah.
My advice to contractors is absolutely, you've got to fill that in. You need to be a compliant bid, but then break it down into more detail. And that more detailed one is the one you're then referencing contract data part 2, because the contractor shouldn't be constrained. It's their pricing document. So advice to clients is, yes, for sure, create something that allows you to do a quick tender comparison at tender stage. No problem with that at all. But then contractors need to be able to and can then submit a more detailed one. It should add up to the same number, obviously.
Yeah,
What happens, that would be a bit confusing, but assuming that's up to the same number, it's just more granularity, and that then does become the activity schedule.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. What you're talking about is the activity schedule that looks more like a traditional cost plan.
Yeah.
Where it's just an elemental breakdown of the works at a very high level. Yes, as Glenn says, for comparison purposes, absolutely a client needs it, but they should also write into their instructions to bidders that you can break it down to more detail beneath those headings, into as much detail as you want. One of the other issues we've just thought of actually is where sometimes where the procurement is more collaborative. So often, like where there's a call off happening under some kind of framework agreement. So they negotiate price, and the price is compiled in an open book way. So the contractor goes off and does sort of quantities, does rates, and they extend out into the prices. But then the whole thing ends up being the activity schedule, and then people misunderstand and think this document is somehow remeasured.
Yeah.
And then really, it's fine as a mechanism for getting to a price. That's absolutely fine. But at the point you're entering into contract, the columns that have the rates and the quantities in should disappear.
Yeah.
And it's just the price at the right-hand side that we're interested in.
Yeah. And also, sometimes a client or a contractor, maybe a contractor, a subcontractor, I see this may be happening more there, where the contractor does a fairly detailed activity schedule for the subcontractor. Now you can see some logic there because they've got one with their client and they want to model that with the subcontractor. But if a contractor does do an activity schedule, maybe a detailed one for the subcontractor may think, well, we've just priced your document, and if you've missed something, that's now your liability. But there's nowhere in the contract that says the liability switches if the other party's done the activity schedule. So in the contractor-subcontractor relationship, it assumes the subcontractor submits the activity schedule. So advice to subcontractors and contractors who are given an activity schedule is, even if it is a detailed one, then normally there'll be a line in very small font at the bottom saying, please feel free to add anything we've missed. And we need to make sure that we do that because it doesn't alter the risk profile because the other party seems to have reduced it. So the contractor's got responsibility in the ECC and the subcontractor's got responsibility in the ECS, the subcontract, to make sure that it reflects the scope.
Yeah. Just one of the things I've just remembered as being an issue is about how preliminaries and risk are dealt with in the activity schedule. So you've got a problem, as we said, if you just price the lump sum for all of your prelims, then you've got a problem that you won't be paid for any of them until you get to the end of the job. So people say, oh, in that case, I'll do a monthly item for my prelims. But then the misunderstanding comes in, and I've seen it both ways, where the client thinks, well, you finished early, so I'm not going to pay you for that 12th month of prelims because you've only done 11 months.
Yeah.
But I've also seen the other way around, where the contractor takes 13 months and thinks they're entitled to an extra month of prelims.
Yes.
Okay, so neither of those things is true. It's a lump sum contract.
Yeah.
And your only entitlement to less or more comes through compensation events.
Yeah, great point. There's another time to revise the activity schedule. So first of all, just picking up on that point, I've done exactly that. So with prelims, you've got two choices. You can either set up January prelims, February prelims, March prelims, and you can just put a lump of money against those.
Mm.
And then the simplicity of that is the contractor's got guaranteed cash coming in, and they'll get paid a regular amount. Or of course, you can just spread that across the activity schedule item. So you don't have to have a preliminary item for your welfare, your cabins, things like that.
Yeah.
If you work out what the value is and then spread it across your activities, then obviously as you complete those activities, you'll then be paid
Yeah.
along the way for
Yeah.
those.
I think that's my personal choice. That's my personal preference.
Yeah.
Okay, we know what the prelims are, so we've done them as a lump sum. We've worked out that they're 20% of the total value. So now, to create a good activity schedule, I could just add 20% onto each activity value and do away with the lump sum for prelims. Because
Yeah.
at the end of the day, the prelims are a function of the work that's happening. You don't do a job for prelims, do you? Yeah, there's always the work that needs to be done.
Yeah.
That's what drives it. And it's the same, thinking about risk. When I've seen risk identified separately, people think, well, you haven't had that risk, therefore I'm not paying you for it. It can't be completed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, that can be problematic. So again, there's a mechanism for arriving at a total price, fantastic. But as soon as you've got that, that risk money should be again distributed across the activity schedule, because again, risk is a function of the work that's happening. It's not a separate thing.
That's great advice, Neil. Yeah, definitely. Risk preliminaries probably, but risk definitely. Don't have that as a single line item. Another one. So again, another reason to revise the activity schedule. Let's say, for example, a contractor was going to have some scaffolding, and they've got a scaffolding item, £50,000. They've now realised that actually the ground doesn't look great, so there may be issues with putting the scaffolding there. So we found a different way of doing it. So different temporary works. But they're not going to do the scaffolding. So if there's £50,000 and they never do it, if it's a lump sum price, the client might be thinking, oh, we're going to get this £50,000 cheaper. Obviously, if the contractor had priced the lift to scaffolding and now realised they needed 2 lifts, I doubt the client's going to pay an extra £50,000.
Yeah.
But they think somehow that maybe they're going to get that saving. Under Option A, obviously, that is the temporary works method is the contractor's choice. But now they will never do that items, they won't be paid for it. So that is another example where they'd have to revise their activity schedule and just spread that scaffolding cost against the install cost, because the install is now going to be trickier and take a bit longer without the scaffolding. So again, that's where I just justify, if I've revised the activity schedule, I'll explain what I've done and why I've done it. And then the client should be receptive. Even if they don't like that, well, it's still the lump sum price. Nothing's changed in the scope.
Yeah.
So we're still entitled to that lump sum price.
Yeah. I think that's another general issue, really, is that even if you haven't done a detailed enough activity schedule, often there's only like a month's lag that you might not, and it's the same when the project manager is assessing the price for work done to date, deciding whether activities are complete or not. They might not think it's complete, and the contractor might get upset that they're not getting paid for something they think they're finished. But that issue should naturally resolve itself the following month anyway. It's people should focus on the fact that the client's going to end up paying all of it at some point. We're just debating and discussing when that payment's going to hit. It's just to facilitate cash flow.
Yeah.
Okay. And again, thinking about it, the fact that the project manager is certifying an activity as complete does not change the contractor's liability for defects in the work that's being paid for. There's the project manager isn't signing off saying, "Yeah, I'm completely happy with that work that's being done."
Yeah.
The client's rights to hold the contractor accountable for defects in that work are the same, whether the work's being complete for payment or not. And that's essentially all we're saying is it's complete for payment.
Yeah.
Yeah, so some project managers would not pay because there's not a test certificate for this thing. They don't need to withhold payment to make sure that the contractor complies with their contractual obligations. That is a common one. And I think there's advice for contractors: just be careful on the wording of the activity schedule item. Because if you've got an item, install pipe, well, what does that mean? Does it have to be backfilled? Does there have to be water running through it?
Yeah.
So if you broke that down into excavate trench, install pipe, backfill trench, pressure test the pipe, and each of these has got a separate item again. It's then clear. I've seen manholes. The the lid hasn't gone on, the lid at the end, because they don't want it damaged. So they've done the 99% of the work. They've not put the lids on, because if they do, someone will run over it and it will get damaged. They've left them off, put a temporary thing on, and they're not being paid for the whole manhole because the lid isn't on. So, okay, fine. So describe it differently. Have the manhole, less the lid, and have a separate item. We're going to go around and put all the lids on all the manholes, and we can just separate that as an activity schedule item.
Yeah, great point, Glenn.
So let's touch on unpriced work. Does that mean that it's automatically a CE? Why is that not the case?
Okay, so there is sometimes an issue, and I say this a lot in training, Glenn, when you say to contractors, so there's no compensation event for you having to do work that you haven't priced.
Yeah.
And they kind of all sit there going, what? What do you mean? I went, well, if the obligation to do that work is described in the scope, then the risk of errors and omissions, as we said, sits with the contractor for the activity schedule. So you need a change in the scope to get paid for doing more work. So, yeah, I think it's often misunderstood by people, is that one.
Yeah, I always say there's no line in the compensation list to say estimators cock-ups. Unfortunately, it's not there. So yeah, we have to accept that is the contractor's risk.
So NEC's obviously evolved from NEC3 to NEC4. What has changed from NEC3 to NEC4 in terms of Option A? Is there anything specifically that's affecting Option A that wasn't present in 3?
A couple of things. So again, natural evolvement of the contracts. The two things I can think of, one is people rates.
Yep.
So there's now an obligation at tender stage for the contractor to pre-agree people rates. So they'll list all the types of people they're going to plan to have on the project and then commit a rate for that person. Now, that's nothing to do with their tender price. A bit like while we're at it, fee percentage in the tender submission for Option A is nothing to do with their tender price. So their lump sum should include their fee percentage. The fee percentage only comes into play for compensation events, and the same for people rates. So if there is a compensation event, we're going to use those people rates that rate is set, and then that's one less thing to argue over. Yeah. We can still argue over how many people we need and how long you need them for.
And how long they were there for, yeah. I guess that's the nature of people, isn't it? But yeah, that was a real positive move, I think, for NEC4 under Option A, was to replace the defined cost of people, which often was contentious, to replace it with simple rates for certain types of people. But as Glenn rightly says, then it just calls into question, well, we're not paying for the commercial director, I've seen. And then you sort of go, well, why are you not paying for the commercial director? Well, that's part of your fee. Okay, but why was there a rate in the schedule of cost components, a rate in contract data part 2 for the commercial director if there was no intention for it to be utilised?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And same with, other more centralised functions like health and safety and managers and quality managers. If the rate is there was clearly an intention that that person would be paid, not paid all the time, but paid for the time associated with the compensation event. So yeah, and I think, this is not a specific Option A point, but the key to this is record keeping, isn't it? That you make sure you have good record, you have resource allocation sheets, you have timesheets, or whatever you have to be able to prove that those people did spend that time on that compensation event, or that they were present on site at that particular point in time.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's absolutely key. And the other one, Glenn, was the value engineering percentage.
Yeah.
So there was no incentive under Option A in NEC3 for the contractor to say to the client, I've come up with a good idea that could save you money, because the client would say, oh, that's great, thank you. I'll now change the scope and remove that work and I'll take all the benefit. Whereas NEC4 introduces this concept of a value engineering percentage. So if the contractor comes up with a good idea and the client and the project manager are happy with it, they then will benefit for a proportion of the saving. So the default percentage in the contract is 50%. That's quite easy. If you've got a £10,000 saving, the contractor gets paid 5, the client gets a 5 saving. Where things get trickier is where we deviate away from 50%. I have to admit, when I first read NEC4, I sort of read it and worked it out and come up with the wrong answer. I came up with the opposite answer. So
Yeah.
basically, the bigger the percentage, the more the client's getting. So if it says 70%, don't think the contractor's getting 70%, it's the client that's getting 70%.
Yeah, I've had a couple of clients recently in recent months where in contract data they've set the value engineering ratio at 10%. I can only assume they thought that meant the contractor obviously got 10%. But the wording is that the prices are reduced by the value engineering ratio applied to the value of the saving, which means the prices come down by 10% and the contractor gets 90%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I always say to contractors, if they spot that, I wouldn't just say, oh, let's just take advantage of that, because probably clients will be so upset that the contractor's going to get so much of the saving, they'll just refuse all the value engineering idea. Never mind,
Yeah.
they're going to get 10% saving, they'll just cut their nose off to spite their face because
Yeah.
the client's going to
Yeah.
get 90. So
Absolutely, yeah.
get around the right way.
Yeah, and I think the message for clients as well is to remember that the higher you make it, that whilst that might be really attractive to you, it's going to work against the whole point of having it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not going to incentivize the contractor enough to want to come up with the idea in the same way. So yeah, I think I think for me, just stick with a straight 50-50. It's clear, it's simple, it seems fair and reasonable.
It's interesting. That's the only default in the whole of contract data. You've probably noticed that, Neil, as well, where
Yeah.
it's the only one where it defaults to a number if it's left blank, which is interesting. I don't think there's anything else that needs it, but at least it covers that point. And obviously, just to emphasize, this is only where it's the client's design. So where it's the client's design and the contractor coming up with an idea, that's when this would apply.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
My favourite part of the podcast. Quickfire question. I am going to put you both on the spot. Most overrated clause in NEC?
Overrated.
Yeah.
I think it's probably clause 10.2, which is infamous in the world of NEC in this obligation to act in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. I don't dislike it. I'm happy it's there. But some people use it for everything. Their excuse or argument is, but in a spirit, mutual trust and cooperation, you should do this. So spirit, mutual trust and cooperation is not going against what the actual wording of the contract says. So for example, you shouldn't act on a verbal instruction because in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation, I'm the client and you should do what I say. So for me, people utilize that clause too much. It pairs with 10.1, which is the obligation to act as stated in the contract. So I wish everyone would focus on 10.1 rather than 10.2.
Yeah. It is a cop-out when it's used in that way. Usually it's in the context of a disagreement about, let's say, a compensation event, or it could be about whether to accept the program or not. And at some point or other, one of the parties will say the immortal words, come on, mutual trust and cooperation. But they don't actually mean that. What they mean is, you need to shut up now and listen to me and do as I say. I'm telling you what the answer is. So when it's used in that context, when it's weaponized like that, that is a cop-out, and it's not how it was intended to be used. As Glenn rightly says, it's the counterpart to the other part of Clause 10, which is act as stated in the contract. And the challenge, and the biggest part of NEC, is getting the two things working together. Okay. Subject for another podcast, I think, Glenn.
I think so.
So Neil,
Ooh.
the most underrated clause in NEC?
Underrated. Oh, gosh. I'm not sure I'm liking these quick-fire ones. I'm going to go for the deemed accepted or treated as accepted provisions. For similar reasons, I guess, for what we've just said with mutual trust and cooperation, that when contractors fear using it because they think they're going to upset the project manager. And then often project managers don't like it because basically the contractor's pointing out that they've not done the job properly. But everybody should try and take their egos out of it. And just all we're doing is trying to move something through the compensation event process or to get a response to it. So, obviously there are 4 in the contract, 3 in compensation events, you've got 1 in with the accepted program. Using it should not be seen as some form of attack.
Yeah.
It should just be seen as a polite reminder. And context is everything. I always say to contractors, look, you use it appropriately, always pick up the phone first. Always speak to the project manager, because you will upset somebody if you just automatically send the reminder and, well, I was actually on the cusp of sending you my response to this, and now you have upset me. So always, pick up the phone, do the mutual trust and cooperation bit, but equally, don't just be afraid to use it. There's an appropriate point where if the response hasn't been received, it should be utilised more.
Yeah.
It should be utilised more, and it should just be seen as that polite reminder in an attempt to move things on.
Yeah.
The other reason contractors don't want to put the deemed acceptance in is because they're not following their own timescales themselves. So they're then worried that if they pull the client on not following their own timescales, well, they're then going to start pulling the contractors on not doing theirs. And then it's like sort of tit for tat. So contractors follow the timescales. And then if you are following the timescales more diligently yourselves, then it will mean that you will feel more confident and saying, well, we're busting a gut here to follow the timescales, and here the project manager's not. So they're the two reasons. So fear of upsetting them and fear of being held to account on your own timescales that you're not following.
Yeah. I remember I once covered this in training, and there was a youngish QS sat at the back of the room, and when I went through the point, you kind of saw a light go on in his eyes, and he picked his phone up, and he started doing this on his phone. And I saw what he was doing. I went, "What are you doing?" I went, "I'm just sending one now. I didn't realise we could do it." And the context of this was it was a startup workshop at the start of a project. So one side of the room you had the contractors team, the other side you had the clients team. And I thought, this is a very bold move. And then I turned to the clients team and said, so what do you think of that then? And it was all the clients' commercial staff, and they were all really pleased that they'd done it. No, it's good. That's what it's there for.
Yeah.
You've not had a response. Get the reminder in. It'll then force an escalation on our side. It'll get prioritised and it'll get dealt with.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect.
And with cloud-based systems, obviously, all the timescales are triggered in. They're automated. So the reminder will then count down the timescales, and if they're really silly enough to ignore the reminder, then it will be deemed accepted.
Yeah.
Just reflecting on it though, not with compensation, but with the program one. So the deemed acceptance of the program was new to NEC4, and I've started to wonder, it solved a problem. The problem being the PM not responding and there being no sanction. But I wonder if it's caused another problem, which is poor decision making. That suddenly the PM's under pressure to respond.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how often the response comes on the last day of the period. And you think, is that a really good quality response? If on a Friday afternoon you've just realised, I have to respond to this today, are you going to really make a good quality decision then? Or is it just forcing I'll find any old reason to not accept it? But that's more of a discussion point.
Excellent. Well, that has been a real clear walkthrough of Option A. What it does well, where teams fall down, and how to get the best out of it. Neil, Glenn, thank you ever so much for your time today. I'm your host, Lauren Flatt, and stay tuned for the next podcast. Thanks,
Lauren.
Thanks, Lauren.